hopefully you either have a piece of paper in front of you or you've printed out that PDF that went along with this assignment. Most years, when there's not a global pandemic going on, we go through this as a class, we sort of brainstorm out all of our answers, and then you guys take a quiz a couple days later. That's clearly not going to work this time. So I will, as I said, briefly go through the various checks and balances with y'all. And your assignment for this is to fill out this chart one way or another. Like I said, you can do it on here, you can do it in a computer, you can make your own. A lot of people like to do it by hand. Just get me the picture for this assignment of your completed checks and balances chart, and you are all good along with the reading and the paragraph you had to do this week. So let's get started. We've talked about checks and balances in the past. Like a lot of things we've done this semester, we alluded to or briefly covered a lot of this stuff back in first semester when we were going over the Constitution and why the Constitution is such an effective document. So today we are going to go through this in counterclockwise order and just make sure you guys are familiar with all this. So first up, we've got executive checks on the legislative branch. Hopefully you recognize at least two of those three buildings. On the bottom left, we have the White House. Top, we have the U.S. Capitol building. And on the right, we have the Supreme Court building looking incredibly ominous in a really well-done photo. So executive checks on the legislative branch are pretty short. They have the ability to veto bills, as we discussed in the last chapter. So either Congress goes out of session before those 10 days of the bill being on the president's desk are up, or Congress does not have the majority and two-thirds majority in both houses to override the president's veto. At that point, the bill does not pass into law, and the status quo remains. That bill has not been passed. The other option that the president has for checking the legislative branch is an executive order. And this one is sort of a half step, but it needs to be addressed. Remember, laws override executive orders, so if Congress gets tired of this, they can pass another law later on. But the executive order is there so the president can say, hey, Congress, you're not doing the job you're supposed to do. Therefore, I'm going to use my executive power to create something so it can go into effect like a law. We saw that on that America's Great Divide thing when they were talking about Barack Obama doing that after Mitch McConnell got very obstructionist and used the Senate to block pretty much any legislation that the president was looking to pass. So there are your two executive checks on the legislative branch. Next, we've got legislative checks on the executive, and this is a doozy. First of all, we've got veto override. Veto override we just talked about. If the president does choose to veto a bill, then Congress has the ability with two-thirds in both houses, so two-thirds of the Senate, two-thirds of the House of Representatives, they can override that veto and pass it into law anyway. This doesn't happen a ton. It happened a lot to Harry Truman, but it happens to presidents occasionally, but it's not super often, but it is a sizable check. And the rationale behind that is simply the idea that, look, if two-thirds of Congress can agree on anything, then it should be going into law and it shouldn't be stopped by just one person, that being the president. Next up, we've got approve appointments. So this is appointments to various judicial openings around the country. So any federal judge needs to be appointed by the president and then have that approved by the Senate. The same goes with heading up any executive agency or cabinet position. I'm sorry, not cabinet position, just executive agency. Anyway, no, cabinet position. Cabinet position and executive agency. Sorry for the hemming and hawing there. I'm just getting too smart for myself. All right, so those are there just to make sure that the person that is taking that job, be it a Supreme Court judge or the head of the Department of Justice or the head of the Department of Agriculture, whatever, is suited for the job. That while there are no hard and fast rules that say a person needs to hit certain criteria to be approved of by the Senate does take this job usually very, very seriously and will go through this with the solemnity and seriousness that it requires. Next up, approving the budget. Remember, the president gets to pitch a budget, but that's as far as it goes. The actual budget that we are going to use for the year is going to be approved by Congress. Next up, this one is iffy. If you want to put a question mark next to that, I am not averse to it. Um, Declarations of war. As we discussed in the executive branch chapter, it used to be that the president always had to go to the legislative branch in order to declare war. That is not really the case anymore with the use of those AUMFs, those authorizations for use of military force. That has changed things to the degree where the president doesn't really need Congress's approval anymore. Congress can still sort of needle the president into getting certain stuff done, especially because of this budget power that they have. But the declaration of war by Congress is not nearly as emphatic a check on the presidency, really, since the Truman administration, basically, with the start of the Korean War. Next up is a big one: impeachment. If Congress believes that the president has done something wrong, then they can impeach him. Remember, first, the House brings the charges, then the Senate acts as the jury and passes a decision on that. Next up, we have amendments and laws. We can put these two together because they're very, very similar. If Congress wants to try to change something that the executive branch is doing, they can either change the law that the president is enforcing or not enforcing via executive order and make that necessary, or they can pass a constitutional amendment, at which point they hand that off to the various states, and the states will then finish that off. So the amendments one is a little bit of a harder road to hoe, but you can still get there, and that still would, if an amendment got passed, say, hey, now you can only serve 2 terms as president, for example. So that's always an option. Checks on the executive. This is super short. As we saw with Article 3 of the Constitution, the judicial branch does not have a whole lot of powers listed out, and as a result, in checks and balances, there's not a ton here, but it's a doozy. Judicial review. Any executive order that the president does is subject to judicial review. For that matter, this isn't really a check, but the president is answerable to the Supreme Court just like any other U.S. citizen, where if the Supreme Court rules and says, for example, hey, Richard Nixon, you need to turn over those tapes that show that you were conspiring during Watergate, then he is obligated to turn those documents over as well. So the Supreme Court can compel the White House to do that. But that's really it for judicial checks on executive. Executive checks on judicial, about the same, pretty quick. Step 1, appoint judges. Remember, you still need to clear it past the legislative branch, but it is the president and the executive branch that are going to look through and find the judges that they want to put into various seats, and then help them get there. Sometimes this works, Brett Kavanaugh. Sometimes it doesn't, Robert Bork in the the Reagan administration. The other one is not really a constitutional check and balance, but it deserves to be addressed because it certainly happened, and that's the actual enforcement of the laws. Remember, judicial branch gets to say yes, thing is or is not constitutional, but it comes down to the executive through the Department of Justice to actually make sure those laws are enforced. So if we think back to Andrew Jackson, he chose not to enforce the rulings that he didn't want to deal with, that said, the Indian Removal Act was unconstitutional. He's like, cool, I'm going to do it anyway. So that is, technically speaking, an executive check on the judicial, albeit an extra legal one. All right, next. Legislative checks on the judicial branch. You'll notice this is kind of similar to what we see with legislative checks on the executive. But here, checking the judicial, first of all, we have the creation of seats. Nowhere in the Constitution does it lay out the actual number of seats in any court in the United States. Nothing says that there have to be 9 Supreme Court justices. We've had as few as 6 in the past. It's gone up and down. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the court and make it 15 so he could get all of those justices that he wanted on the court. Technically, Congress has the power to do that. They can not only create seats, they can also create, like we saw in the judicial branch, they can create entire new tiers of courts. Remember, the U.S. Court of Appeals, that circuit court, comes out of congressional legislation in the 1890s to help out the Supreme Court. Going along with that, once those seats are created, the people that are appointed to those seats in the judiciary need to have those seats approved. So, like we talked about, Once the president appoints a judge, then it is still up to Congress to say whether or not that person actually gets to be a judge. If a Supreme Court judge or really any lower court judge does anything impermissible, there is impeachment. I encourage you to look at that Wikipedia list of impeached judges. It's a lot of like taking bribes, but also just being drunk on the bench in the 1800s. And then the other two are obviously amendments and laws. So, way more amendments here, but laws deserve to be addressed too. So, in the case of amendments, obviously, if an amendment passes, that's going to change the way the Supreme Court is going to interpret everything going forward. But laws are also a big deal here. The judicial branch actually encourages the legislative branch to do this because it helps them out. Is they'll basically say, hey, make law X more specific, and then we don't have to give these very kind of broad rulings because Congress never got around to it. So the legislative branch can sort of guide the judicial branch with what laws it would like to create. Now, the judicial branch obviously still has its big check back on the legislative. If those laws go too far, then judicial review can render them constitutionally invalid and unenforceable. Remember, you cannot judicially review an amendment. An amendment is an addition to the Constitution and thereby is automatically legal. There is no debating an amendment. On the other hand, laws, that's pretty much what the Supreme Court is there for. So, we have gone through the various checks the legislative, executive, and judicial have on each other. There will be no quiz for this, obviously, because I can't look over all of your shoulders, and it would be weird if I did from, Zoom or something weird like that. So just make sure this is filled out, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments either on this assignment or on the YouTube video of this, and we'll be all good to go. There will be one more bell ringer this week. And remember, everything is due on Sunday, and I'll send out another email next Sunday night or Monday morning telling you what the week to come has in store. Hope you're all staying healthy, washing your hands and everything. And remember, if you got questions, I can talk with you guys on Thursday from 12 to 2 on Zoom. I will put the code up there. It'll be the same as last time. All right. Have a good one, folks.